Okay, picking up where we left off, the initial battle has taken place at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And we've looked at the sort of northern advantage and the southern advantages as both sides are coming into this conflict. And a few days after the conflict at Fort Sumter, the Union is very successful at meeting Lincoln's demands for 75,000 enlisted troops in the Union Army. The people who initially sign up for service agree to 90 days of service. And this should show you what Lincoln is thinking about this war. He's not asking for 4 years of commitment from these soldiers. He's not asking for, 3 years. He's not asking for a year. He's asking for 3 months. That's how quickly he sees this war coming to an end. In addition to that, Lincoln is going to basically starve out the South. They're following what's known as the Anaconda Plan. Basically, if you're familiar with the anaconda, it's a big constricting snake that lives in the Amazon. What the North wants to do to the South is completely surround it and isolate it. Block it off so that no supplies can come in or out. Because as we saw, looking at those numbers going into the war, the South cannot sustain itself. It doesn't have enough internal manufacturing, internal weapons production, internal banking capital, or internal sort of manpower to really sustain the war effort. So as part of this, he needs to block off the West. Obviously, the North is blocked by the boundary lines between the North and South, but he also needs to blockade the South. And he's going to do this along the southern coast of the U.S., both along the Atlantic coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. Volunteers crammed into recruiting stations in the North. It was not difficult to meet that 75,000 troop number. In fact, the Union recruiters are actually turning potential troops away at the beginning of the war. That's how many people were willing to go and fight against this process of secession. Now, among the people who are trying to volunteer at the outset of the war are African Americans living in the North. But these soldiers would be turned away for the first few years of conflict. Lincoln does not want African American soldiers fighting alongside the white volunteers. There's a few key reasons for this. We still are not at a point, I've pointed it out again and again in this class. Belief in abolition does not mean belief in racial equality. And so they don't believe that African Americans are fit to fight alongside white soldiers, but there is a more practical and less ideological reason here. And that is the fact that Lincoln knows that if he allows African American soldiers to pick up weapons and go fight white Americans in the South, this will damage his reputation and his ability to maintain what we call the border states. The border states are a key thing that you need to take away from this lecture. Because what's happening here is there's this assumption that the entire country splits north and south, everybody takes a side, and then everybody goes to war. But that is not the reality. There are a number of slaveholding states that choose not to break away, that stay with the Union. Those states are Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. All 4 of those border states will maintain their alliance with the Union, although it's difficult to hold on to these states. Now, in these states where slavery is legal, but they're still supporting the war effort for the Union, if you take in African American slaves, this damages your ability to maintain these states. And so we're going to look at those 4 border states individually as the lecture moves on, but that's largely his reasoning for not allowing African American soldiers to join the war effort at the outset. Now, as I mentioned, despite the fact that the North easily hits their troop numbers, it easily is going to be able to meet these requirements to go to war, they don't have real troops. They have a bunch of non-professional soldiers. These are people who work in other professions. They don't have any combat experience, and so they're getting a bunch of green recruits, people who have never really seen active conflict on the battlefield. Now, despite the fact that only 1/3 of the U.S.'s military leadership breaks away and goes with the South, that third of the leadership, as I've already pointed out, they are the ones with real military battlefield experience. They are the ones who actually know how to command troops in war. Whereas the leadership in the North, the Union leadership, the generals and the commanders for the Union, are really more politically connected people who are just well positioned in society. They're more accustomed to parading with their soldiers, like I said, in fancy uniforms. When these troops are pouring into recruiting stations in 1861, they have yet to get this unified sort of look to the Union Army. They haven't adopted that full blue uniform that we're used to seeing today. But very quickly, they're going to get rid of the fancy sort of European-esque military outfits. Each regiment wore, they had their own different outfit, and they start to go with the general blue for the Union by 1862, whereas the South will adopt the familiar gray military uniforms that we see on the slides there if you're going through the slideshow. So, in order to mobilize troops for the South, it's a little bit of a different process going on there. The Confederacy has different problems altogether. It's not about military experience or military leadership. It's about the fact that they don't have an army to begin with. They have to build everything from scratch. This is a brand new nation. And so what they're going to do is use local and state militias in the South. They start expanding and reorganizing these militias. So they start working with the militias to start turning them into the Confederate Army. And they're successful in doing this by March of 1861 because they have good leadership. They're able to quickly get these recruits. And these militias had largely sort of collapsed into drinking clubs for the most part. But the Southern leadership is going to be able to whip them back into shape and get them ready to fight by March of 1861. Now, in order to fight Lincoln's naval blockade, the South, or the Confederacy, they don't have a navy, and so they have a problem here. And we're going to go back to what we saw in the American Revolution and in previous battles that we've looked at. What the South is going to do is effectively turn to privateering. They're going to employ pirates to go and steal Union ships, and then they're going to turn those Union ships around and start fighting other Union ships with them. This is not meant to actually win a naval engagement. What it's meant to do is distract the naval blockade that the North has put into place long enough to allow supply ships to come in and drop off weapons, food, clothing, ammunition, everything they need to support the war effort in the South. So, despite an aggressive push to build a navy and to build up manufacturing centers in the South is not really ever going to be able to do this in the way that they need to. A common theme throughout this war is that the South is undersupplied. They simply don't have what they need. You'll hear a lot of stories about them essentially having to scour battlefields when the battles have come to a close. They're going and picking up unspent shells. They're picking up weapons that are still functional. They're pulling boots off of dead soldiers because they don't have enough for their troops. And so this is it'll be happening all throughout the course of the war. But really what I'm trying to point out here and what this means is that the Confederacy is going to need to turn to foreign allies. They need to turn to European nations to help them sustain their war effort. By the end of the war, the number that we're looking at is about 700,000 weapons are going to be imported to the Confederacy from abroad. And their main trade partner is going to be England. England will be supporting the South throughout the war. And it's not until you see some really high-profile incidents where the Union caught some of these supply ships that the British are going to back off and start removing their support from the South. Now, with virtually no banks and no currency in the South, they don't use the U.S. dollar anymore because they're not part of the United States. What they're going to do is start just arbitrarily printing their own money in the South. The Confederacy would print over $1 billion Confederate dollars by 1864. There's a problem here. They're printing paper money, but it doesn't mean anything. This leads to hyperinflation in the South. They are really dealing with a massive economic problem there. And so they're going to have 9,000% inflation by 1863. What this means is that the Confederate money is ample, but it's useless. You can't buy any real common household products with it without having thousands and thousands of Confederate dollars. And so, with all of these issues going on, they also, ironically, are going to start to have states versus federal rights going on in the South. So, effectively, the South is saying that the federal government of the United States trampled on their states' rights. But once the Confederacy is its own independent government, they have a hard time compelling the individual states within it, places like Alabama and Mississippi, to give the requisite number of troops or weapons or food for the war effort. So they're constantly going to be dealing with economic and supply problems in the South. This will be an ongoing issue for the Confederacy from the beginning of the war all the way until the end. So it's something to keep in mind as we keep talking through some of the battles that we'll be encountering. Now, with all that said, we've talked about the North and how they've mobilized troops. We've talked about the South and how they have tried to mobilize their armies. This leaves us with those sort of nebulous areas in the middle, what we call the border states. Not every single slaveholding state in the United States broke away with the South. Their state leaders are going to desire to keep slavery. And remember, Lincoln hasn't made slavery illegal. He hasn't made any sort of orders of that nature. And so there are these border states that are going to say, we want to keep our slaves, but we also don't want to break away and fight against the United States in a war. And so ultimately, the border states are going to be Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. So those 4 states all hold slaves throughout the Civil War, but they all support the Union war effort. They're all part of the Union throughout the war. Now, these states are of incredible strategic importance, and we're going to look at each one as we go through. Kentucky and Missouri are both really important because they provide really critical riverine access for the Union. In other words, if you hold Kentucky and Missouri, you can easily move your troops out to the Mississippi River. And the Ohio River valleys are running through Kentucky as well. And so if you've got access to these 2 rivers, you can use boats to move your materials and your troops really quickly. And so that's why those 2 areas are going to be of high importance, both to the Union and to the Confederacy. Delaware is another important state because it provides a buffer zone between the Confederacy and a very important sort of manufacturing center in the North in Philadelphia. If you take Philadelphia away, you can basically move Confederate boats right. If you take Delaware away, you can move boats right up to Philadelphia and start bombarding the city. And that is a huge manufacturing center for the North. Finally, Maryland is arguably the most important of the border states. When you look at where Washington, D.C. is at on a map, it is wedged in between Virginia in the south and Maryland in the north. So Washington, D.C. is right there in the middle. So Virginia is quickly going to become the capital of the Confederacy. They're going to move it out of Montgomery, Alabama, and up to Richmond, Virginia early in the war effort. So Virginia is a Confederate state. And so on the south, Washington, D.C. is bordered by the Confederacy. In the north, that's Maryland. If they lose Maryland, the capital of the United States will be surrounded by Confederate territory. So it is of critical importance that they hold that area. Now, when we look at this economically and militarily, this is important as well because if you were to take those 4 states and say they're not part of the Union anymore, they've now moved to the Confederacy. That would represent 80% of Southern manufacturing. You would be upping their manufacturing abilities by 80%, just taking those 4 states and having them move to the Confederacy. And it would also make up nearly half of the Southern white male population, the people who are fighting in this war. And so it is a huge manpower and manufacturing power advantage for the Union to maintain those states. And it's not so much that the Union needs the manpower from those states or needs the manufacturing from those states. It's that the South needs it very badly, and the North needs to make sure they don't get it. And so they're going to be holding on to those border states for dear life. And Lincoln's going to have to take some drastic steps in order to hold these states. And we'll see what those are in a few slides coming up here. But there's one more reason these border states are important. The South is saying this war is about them trying to take our slaves away. And Lincoln's saying this is about secession and the fact that you've broken away illegally. So it's hard. It gives the Union a key sort of rhetorical advantage in all of this to have those states. Lincoln can go, look, it's not about slavery because 4 slave states are fighting with us, not with you. And so it gives them that sort of advantage in rhetoric. And as we're moving forward on the slides here, you can look in that map and the border states are in red. And so that'll show you where those areas are on the map and why they're so important. And you'll also see a sort of interesting caveat I want to point out here. It won't be on an exam, but it's interesting to see. You will see that West Virginia is outlined as part of the Union there, and it's obviously, as the name suggests, on the western side of Virginia. Now, West Virginia doesn't actually come into existence until 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. They break away because they do not want to be part of Virginia. This is a mountainous area. There are poor people up there who live in the mountains. They don't own slaves. They don't care about slavery. That's not their problem. And so they choose to form an independent state out of the western part of Virginia because they do not want to be part of the Confederacy. And so they will automatically join up with the Union when they declare their independence from Virginia. Now, to wrap up this little mini lecture video, we're going to talk about how Lincoln will maintain these border states. In the end, the Union will hold all of them, all throughout the course of the war, but it's not going to be easy. Delaware is arguably the easiest state to hold because Delaware, only 2% of their population owns slaves in the first place. Slavery's not that big of an institution there. So it's pretty easy for them. They're never really threatening to leave the Union in the first place because slavery's not a huge issue to them. Kentucky is kind of split in half between pro-Confederate and pro-Union leanings. But Lincoln is able to essentially hold on to this state and negotiate with their state leadership throughout the war. And he's also going to have to send in federal troops at one point and reinforce the state to ensure that Kentucky maintains its ties to the Union. Now, Maryland is definitely going to be a problem for Lincoln. And that's because Maryland has a very large slaveholding population relative to the other states in the upper South or what we could call the mid-Atlantic region. Now, they have a strong pro-Confederate sentiment there. And ultimately, when the Confederacy is sort of trying to pull Maryland in, the Union is struggling to hold on to them. But Maryland, as I talked about, it's of key geographic importance. The Union Army is trying to march the 6th Regiment from Massachusetts down through Maryland, and they're trying to get them into the border of Virginia, into Washington, D.C., on the border of Virginia. And as these troops are marching down, pro-Confederate sympathizers start basically attacking these troops in April of 1861. The Union soldiers are going to return fire on them. They actually fire on these crowds of Confederate sympathizers, and a mob begins to form. In order to continue to control Maryland, Lincoln has to start suspending civil law and civil rights in Maryland. He says the whole area is now under martial law. The Union Army is going to be under control of Maryland to make sure we don't lose it. In addition to that, he starts suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Now, I don't want to get too much into United States legal history, but this is an important law. What he's going to be able to do by suspending the writ of habeas corpus is he's going to be able to arrest Confederate sympathizers, throw them in jail, and never present them with their supposed crimes or charges. He's going to be able to lock up Confederate sympathizers for the duration of the war without ever really bringing fair charges against them in a court of law. He also will start basically summarily having the courts judge people without them being able to be present in court and defend themselves. So this is a big problem for Lincoln. Because the South's down there going, Abraham Lincoln's a tyrant. He wants to enslave white people to African Americans. That's what he's really all about. He wants to be the king of the United States and put African Americans in charge. And when he starts violating the civil rights of people of Maryland, this gives more fodder to the South. They go, aha, you see, that's what Lincoln thinks of your inalienable rights. That's what he thinks of your civil rights. He doesn't care about it. He will suspend them and get rid of them on the drop of a hat if it suits him because he's a king, he's not a president. And so it really reinforces a lot of that rhetoric that's driving poor whites in the South to the recruiting stations, getting them to join this Confederate war effort. Ultimately in Missouri, what happens there is a little quasi-civil war breaks out. The Confederacy supports a small army there, and the Union supports a small army there. But under the command of a guy named Nathaniel Lyon, a military general from the North, that Union troops are going to be able to hold Missouri and make sure that they stay a part of the Union. So the Union is going to be able to maintain these border states, and that is critical for two reasons. One, it deprives the South of this badly needed military and manufacturing and manpower advantage that they would have gotten if they took them. Secondly, it will continue to push this idea that the war is not about slavery, it is about secession. It is about illegally breaking away from the United States. So that will wrap up this little mini lecture video. We're going to move on to the actual warfare in the early campaigns in the next video. But I want you to really pay attention to what's going on with the border states, as that is going to form a big portion of your final exam.